Good morning and welcome to Monday's edition of Shortcuts for Your Soul. It's Monday, December the 13th, 2021. And today I have the delightful pleasure of having a being with us. He's commonly known as the founding father of psychology, but he was really just another individual bringing forth the truth of what we are and what we are not. One of the things Freud helped us to do was to distinguish the difference between who you are as an awareness and your body and mind. Unfortunately, he did not get to complete his work the way he originally wanted to, as in his later years he began to understand that awareness, body, and mind and emotions were independently functioning elements of our collective consciousness internally and as a species. But fear, he says there's three things that the ego requires in order to be kept alive. And that was, he said it was fear, anger, were the two primary things that are necessary for keeping your ego in a state of life and control and power. Without fear and anger, the ego has no use. Your awareness, which is something that was arguably undetectable because we still viewed ourselves as exclusively the physical mechanism. But please understand that the only thing that keeps the ego alive is fear. Whether it is the fear of imminent death or it is the fear that one will not have fulfillment, My reason for coming to this time and this day is to allow you to understand and have the information that the only way you can be manipulated or controlled is through the ego. Your soul functions independent of and is designed initially to be the controlling element over what you call the personality. There is clear distinctions between the body and the mind of an individual. That was easy to establish, but what we did not understand was that there was an element a little higher up in the scale of consciousness that we call the awareness, what your religion calls soul, and some religions call spirit. And there is no distinction between that which is the soul and that which is the spirit, although there are degrees in awareness of what part is organizing and orchestrating another. For example, thoughts in your mind can orchestrate very precise and deliberate effects in the expressions you have through matter. But did you not know that there's also an aspect of yourself that can orchestrate your mind? And this is what I discovered after leaving the form, that this aspect of self called the soul was designed to originally be positioned to orchestrate and alter and change conditions of mind and matter. We went through great pains to try and understand why behavior was what behavior was. But what we did not understand when we unlocked what you call the unconscious mind, what we did not understand is that the unconscious mind could function independent of the individual awareness only if there was an emotional association to the unconscious patterns. But even in later years, I began to realize that through the perspective of observational awareness, that one could assert complete dominance and change over any existing personality trait or behavior, whether it was a short-term established behavior or a long-term established behavior. That the portion of awareness that can be awakened, that is being awakened now is a portion that can literally change any behavior long established and many conditions of matter. What I called the ego is simply that part of your consciousness that you call the body, and the thoughts of the personality that are, I'll use the term, intertwined with the conditions of the body. The deliberate changes in one's behavior simply required a different degree of awareness that could be independently established from the body and the thoughts. The moment the individual can establish that distinction between self, thought, emotion, and body, there was another controlling element over the conditions of the ego. But without any doubt, we came to the understanding that the ego, in order to thrive, requires that there is fear. In this state of fear, an individual is amenable to control, that the functions of reason are suspended when the intensities of fear are increased. At that point, the organism can be overwhelmed by the vibrational frequencies of fear. When that happens, it seeks relief from that. The biology seeks relief from the stresses that this fear places on it. And that relief either comes through isolation, or that relief will come through influence from the environment. So that those seeking alleviation from fear would look oftentimes to an authority, usually a one of greater knowledge or understanding that could direct. It was one of the things that gave hierarchical order to animal life forms. The organization of groups of animals was based on the ones that feared the most and the ones that feared the least. Those that feared the least tended to govern or lead the herds of those that were in fear. The dominant correlation between animals and humans from a biological perspective was identical in that respect, that if an individual or a group of individuals is more fearful, then the one that is least in fear could direct those that were more in fear. Survival, from the perspective of biology, depends exclusively on the organism's ability to avoid the simple function of pain and to experience the simple function of pleasure. But what was not fully revealed is that there is a point in your consciousness where fear does not exert an influence over your thoughts, your reasoning, and your actions. On that perspective, there is a freedom that is afforded to but a few who care to awaken, to become cognizant of this, that there is this place in your cognizance, your awareness, where you recognize the distinction between your ego, which I will simply say is the physical body, the correlation of thoughts that you have integrated with it from your experiences, and the emotional associations installed in that. The ability that you have to awaken to the lesser functions of those restores you to the position of conscious functionality, independent of preceding influences established by your historical experiences. There was an elegant simplicity, but I was so perplexed by how behaviors could seem so different across so many people that generalities became a mechanism from which I formed many of my conclusions, which were incorrect, except on a fundamental level. The realization that emotion, when it is able to be harnessed and directed by awareness rather than left as something, as a subjective function of the body's impetus to survive, that point of awareness is where one can begin to pursue the higher truths of what you would call divinity, which many religious philosophies refer often to as the soul, that place in consciousness where you awaken, that you recognize you are independent of thought, you are independent of matter, that thought and matter are interdependent upon you to interact with them in order for them to function at all, that the body and the structures of the body are exclusively survival based, much the same way as animals are. Your body is as an animal, but your ability to make the distinction between the influence of body and the influence of emotion, as you can begin to make changes, rapid, permanent changes in the nature of your mind and body. But in order to do this, one must become conscious of the distinction between their awareness and this element of there being the body that does function from a platform exclusively of survival, exclusively from survival. That is all that your body can function from. Whereas you are able to function independent of it, even independent of the thoughts that have been acquired from your experiences. Dimensions of awareness begin to become available at that point where you are able to make the distinction between the personality you have. I could simply use the term ego for your whole personality, that construction of yourself that you view as your individual self in that body, that part of you that views yourself as a body, that part of you that views yourself as simply a collection of thoughts, as a collection of emotions that are associated to those thoughts. That is the ego. The aspect or concept of the higher self, the greater self, this component called the soul, awareness, that is able to function, and demonstrably so, separate from the dictates of the body's survival mechanisms, independent of the dictates of conceptual ideas that may or may not inhibit or augment specific actions or behaviors, that once that aspect of your being awakens to the differentiation between thought and emotion and body, in that moment, that is when you begin to become liberated from influences of ego. Understand that ego, quite simply, diminishes or increases according to the level of fear that one is experiencing. The lesser the fear is, the greater one's capacity to affect change in the conditions of their life. Fear again is not inherent in what you are. It is inherent within the body, but only as a mechanism of survival. When that mechanism of survival impedes or inhibits your conscious awareness from making distinctions between what you have been taught to know and what you can think independent of what you've been taught to know, then you have issues of social control and power that can operate on the level of small groups, but also entire civilizations. This distinction that needs to be made between the awareness that governs thought, the awareness that can govern emotion, the awareness that can govern body, and remain unsubjugated to them. From that perspective, concerns of control and power, as well as concerns of great altruism, can emerge from there. Yes, altruism in its greatest. I'm just asking him questions as he's speaking. That great control and great power do emerge at that point of independence from thought, independence from emotion, independence from body. It's in that moment that any concerns of altruism or control and power emerge in your consciousness. We saw the very beginnings, in my biological experience, we saw the very beginnings of mass, what you would call mass hypnosis emerging, wherein those that were not as subjective to fear recognized the correlation between fear and control, tipping the scales of social evolution in one direction, but also causing great pains in doing so for civilization as a whole. The imbalance between power and control from the perspective of an egoless state. And remember, when I say egoless state, I'm simply referring to that process of awareness that allows one to distinguish between the survival mechanism of the body, the existing thoughts that work with it, and the emotions that bind these in actions. And that distinction of awareness allows you to be fearless. But those that do not have that distinction are bound still by that mechanism of fear. In other words, they can be manipulated and controlled. Those of you that live in fear can easily be manipulated and controlled. And without that distinction in your awareness between how you are as a consciousness, as an awareness, observational of thought, observational of emotion, observational of body, without that awareness, you are basically one of the herd, and there is one in the herd that is always leading the herd. This is always true in the animal kingdom. This is equally true in the human kingdom. In large group dynamics, we saw the same thing. Those with the least fear, or those that understood the mechanisms of fear, could control others that were subjective to it. And reason is always suspended in that context. There could be no thinking, no capacity for independent thought, independent of the group, if the emotional contingencies of fear are dominant in the consciousness of individuals. It is only when those individuals are able to distinguish themselves from certain emotional expressions that they can actually begin the process of thinking independent, moving into a process then of orchestrating group dynamics, of organizing social structure and social evolution. The challenge that we also notice emerging is that through the social control of the dynamic of fear in large numbers of people, eventually swings to great conflict. And that this conflict often leads to war. It becomes quite an uncontrollable dynamic until the simple equation of which one has the least fear often wins the greatest victories. The understanding that the articulations of fear, when perpetrated in a group or group of individuals, the least fear in all situations ends up becoming the dominant factor in the process of directing human activity. Those with the least fear are dictating and determining the course of humanity subsequently. Wow. Thank you. The fear. So the ego requires fear in order to exist. Yes. Without fear, is the ego gone? No, it is not completely gone. You must understand that there needs to be some form of what you would call ego, because ego, again, is based in survival. And because there's a physical component to human existence, there needs to be an element of emotion in order for that physical existence to be animated. There was no behavior that could occur without some form of an emotion engaged in it. In cases of individuals where there was a catatonic state, we often notice that there could be no expression, that if emotion were completely withdrawn from one's expression, you could essentially do anything to that form. Once emotion is withdrawn, basically they become the living dead, you might say. So all human interactivity requires some degree of ego in the form of an emotion. Then the ego can be considered good or evil according to the nature of that emotion, for the expressions of love and the expressions of fear necessitate very different manifestations in human conditions. And what would you have now? When we watched the wars rage, we understood clearly that this was, again, a manipulation of ego. But you must always have some ego in order to have the experience of a physical realm where you can interact deliberately with physical matter. The grosser form of emotion certainly alters conditions of matter very differently than the feeling nature of the soul. Wow. Thank you. Wow. Good morning, everybody. How are we doing? Yes. So what I'm hearing him say is, if we're in a state of fear, we have an ego. If we're in a state of love, we have an ego. Is this correct? Yes, it is. Okay. So if the societal expressions that you will see from either perspective of the ego, whether it is an expression of fear or an expression of love, there are very huge differences in the expression, not only on a larger social scale, but on a smaller individual scale. But again, in order to initiate changes in your ego from a state of fear to a state of love, you must become conscious of the nature of your awareness as that functions independent of your thought, but not separate from it, which is what reasoning is, where you as awareness are able to clearly understand and identify your relationship to the thoughts that you may choose or not choose to align your awareness to. And again, the reliance you have upon your body to have expression for your body is a very simple mechanism that depends exclusively on pleasure and pain, life and death. Again, I had originally formulated the concept of there being instinct, a death instinct and a life instinct. The herding instinct, there were very specific things that I gave labels to that did not fully ennoble humans with the opportunity and the information to make a distinction between the instincts and the awareness that was governing the form. The unnecessary loss of the self to the instincts was the net result of my earlier work. The idea that the individual has no choice but is compelled to follow these instincts was never the complete truth. That so long as an individual remains identified with the nature of the body itself, then that would technically remain true. But if the individual begins to recognize the independence of the self from these baser impulses of pleasure and pain, of fight and flight, the minute that distinction is made, the individual begins a process of transcendence, which many of my followers began to come to conclusions about, that there was another self that was indeed capable of orchestrating change over thought, emotion, and the instincts very differently than what I had ascertained in the earlier works. I understand now, of course, there is a vast difference between what I am and what I believed myself to be in the form. It is a natural consequence that when you shed one layer of your personality, that there is another layer that emerges. When the body ceases to function, the consciousness does not cease to exist. Although I remained in darkness for quite some time. By darkness, I mean simply in a place of not really being aware. And then many called upon me to try to understand some of the errors in my understanding. That calling forth awoke me. It awoke me to my existence still being existing, independent of matter. When this occurred, there were others that appeared before me that I began to learn from. But this process of ego in error must be relinquished. There is an element of the self that is not visible to the five physical senses, but is perceptible to the awareness of the individual. As easily as you might perceive the fingers on your hand, the question then becomes obvious that, well, who is that is perceiving the hand? Whether the eyes are open or the eyes are closed, you can feel that there is something in motion. You can see that something is motion. That which is seeing is not the body. That which is seeing is not the thought. That which is seeing is not the emotions. And that self is the greater self. The what you would call soul, the puppeteer over the form. That point of distinction is essential for the next step in human collective evolution, this step of awareness of the self. I say that the ego needs fear or love to exist in the form. And this is true. If you have not fear nor love, you have no need. If you have not fear or love, you have no need. There is no requirement then for existence. So if you are here, you have need then. But is your need driven by fear or is your need driven by love? Again, your awareness allows you to make the distinction in your being. This level of awareness is essential. You function independent of that body. You can function independent of that body, but you cannot experience what you call the life of this world without a body. Not even in this mechanism here, coming through this form, and any form, you require a form for that which is formless to be perceived. And yet there is clear evidence that although the form can be directed, there is a conscience that functions independent of it too. That there is your soul functions independent of matter, but is causative to it. the definitions of these polar opposites of what you call love and fear are, again, only provide the supporting movement and energy to allow you to experience this condition of physical world. Again, there must be a medium through which consciousness can flow in order for observances and changes in matter to be perceived. There must be a form of some kind through which consciousness can express. Even the rock or the tree or the bird is a mechanism for consciousness. The degree and alteration of its expression is determined by a variety of different factors, which I will not go into any great detail at this time. But suffice to say that there must be some form in order for consciousness to be perceptible to your physical senses. To your awareness, there is a different perceiving apparatus that you utilize in the perception of consciousness. And yes, this is but one dimension of experience and being. But from the perspective of being observable to the senses, there must be a mechanism through which your consciousness can express to be perceptible to the senses. Except wherein those of you that have these alternate senses, what I initially labeled as telepathy, the ability to perceive independent of stimulation of the senses, that this aspect of the self that is the awareness, that the soul, the being, from there you can make different changes in your experience of being. There are other realms that you may experience that are independent of matter, but in order to be perceptible to matter, there must be a form through which the matter can express. Your ego cannot exist without matter. Your ego cannot exist without matter. This I truly understand now, that your ego cannot exist without matter. Wow. Thank you so much. Good morning, everyone. Hello, Catherine. Question from Catherine. Before Jesus, what does it mean when you're merrily going along and get bad anxiety that seems to come out of nowhere? What is that? Yes. I like, there's a guy named Dr. Joe Dispenza, brilliant man. He's a genius like everybody else really is. And emotion, just put it down this way, emotion is just energy in motion. But for you specifically, your anxiety is based on that event that you have chosen to ignore. You thought you had dealt with it, but you didn't. It is time to forgive yourself. What do you mean by that? To let go of her suffering, to let go of her fear about what might happen. Yes. If you understand clearly, the only time memory can play a role in your present is if you have not resolved certain emotions that you have connected to those memories that have relevant connections in the present. Much the same way as a dog may have bit you when you were a young child, and when that happened, there was great fear and a simple process of what you call association to that dog, to your emotions, to the bite. That, again, depending upon the nature and existing conditions at that time, the emotion could have been allowed to run unchecked, and now you have a fear or a terror of dogs, even though since that time no dog has ever harmed you, but you find yourself feeling very anxious around dogs, and you just know that you're afraid. You do not understand why. Again, the ability that you have to differentiate between the nature of certain qualities of emotion and what you are as awareness, you can eliminate your fear and your suffering very quickly, your anxiety, can be liberated fairly quickly when you understand the distinction between your awareness, your thoughts, your emotions in the body. That distinction in perception allows you to recognize that that which is being perceived is something that's independent of you. So you may feel this intense anxiety, and your natural tendency from a perspective of the body alone, your body wishes to avoid anything that could be perceived as a threat to it. Even if the threat is not real, your body will seek to avoid a threat, even if it is imagined, even if it is remembered. And your ability to make the distinction, what this one reveals very clearly is that you may also interact with certain qualities of emotion differently and intentionally. You may ameliorate your suffering very quickly. It's not necessary. It's not necessary. But yeah. Great question. Question from Vanessa. How to talk to the subconscious to take it from focus of fear to dwelling in love? He's saying it's very simple. If you understand the inductive capacity of the nervous system to certain emotional predispositions, then the very nature of giving your attentions to subconscious elements that have now become conscious. In the case of this one that is just spoken of anxiety, she speaks of an emotion that subsides and rises up from her subconscious. And the way in which she consciously interacts with that or does not interact with that determines its rising and falling, its comings and goings in her life. We could go deeper into the concept of stimulus and response, the fundamentals of what stimulates certain emotional conditions. But ultimately, to talk with your subconscious mind is simply that, from the perspective of realizing that certain qualities of thought and emotion are amenable to your interaction with them, then the nature and way in which you would interact with them would be very different. To speak to your subconscious mind like, I don't like you, I don't love you, you disrespect me. If you attack your subconscious, it will fight you back. The ego will fight you back if you attack it, because it delights in exercising its nature. Your ego delights in exercising its nature, which is to fight, to flee, to obtain pleasure, quite simply. And when you don't indulge it in such a fashion, you can liberate yourself very quickly from it. So if you perceive your anxiety or you perceive your rage and anger, then simply not affording them anything other than your compassion and kindness, you'll see a great change in your emotional energies very quickly. Yeah. The way that I've learned to do is if I feel something frustrating come up, I actually stop. I feel the part of me that's frustrated or angry or anxious, and I'll feel it, and I'll communicate to it like it's a child. I actually communicate to my subconscious mind like it's a child. I'll say to it, I'm with you, I love you, I'll never abandon you. I always talk to my subconscious mind, my ego, with love. That's really the fastest way. When you feel anxiety, you start telling your anxious part, saying, hey, I'm with you, I love you, I'll take care of you, right? And then get the body to relax, right? Get the body to be still, get the body to be quiet. Because remember, fear, the perception of fear causes certain, yes, he's saying once you perceive an emotional quality, behavior is inevitable. Once you give attention to specific emotional qualities, behavior is inevitable. The minute you take your attentions away from certain emotional qualities, that behavior diminishes in its expression. But as long as your attentions are on that behavior, then it is inevitable that it will emerge as an expression, whatever that emotion might be. Cool. Well, question from Animation. Do my guides have a message for me? Be still. Be very still today. Just be very still today. In whatever you're doing, wherever you're going, be still. Be very still in whatever you're doing. Even if you're driving a truck or flying a plane, be still in what you do today. Cool. Question from Adam. Can I ask Archangel Raphael on how does the defense mechanisms in the astral body function in the prevention of illness? From the perspective of absolute awareness that is functioning consciously, there is no response other than love. There is no response other than love to illness. Again, from the perspective of function and form, if you perceive anything as a threat, the natural tendency is to attack it. There is no reaction except love. There's no reaction except love. Is the ego the veil? Yes, he says you can call the ego the veil. That's a very apt, he's saying apt, I don't know how that word goes, A-P-T, a very apt term for the ego would be the veil, which is the body, the mind, the emotions, which are the veil between who you are as a soul. When you make that distinction between your body, your emotions, your thoughts, and you as the awareness observing them, you begin to lift the veil. That distinction facilitates the lifting of the veil when you realize that your thoughts, your memories, your emotions, your body are not the sole locus of your identity. You begin to lift the veil, because then different considerations come into play. When you consider, if I am not my thoughts, then who am I? If I'm not this body, then who am I? If I'm not these emotions, who am I? You begin to lift the veil. You begin to perceive something other than what you've been conditioned to perceive as the self. But yes, you may certainly see that. Oh, you're welcome, Vanessa. Yes, well, it's been quite an interesting morning for me. So I just bring you up an update. So on Wednesday, I got Archangel Michael coming in, and it's who do you need to trust and how? And again, yes, who do you need to trust and how? That's Wednesday with Archangel Michael. Please come and join us for that. On Friday, I've got John the Baptist coming in. He's calling it freedom from stupidity in order to keep your peace. Freedom from stupidity in order to keep your peace. And that will be on Friday with John the Baptist. For those of you that are new to the channel, please, if you have enjoyed this material, please remember to click the like, the thumbs up button. If you want to, subscribe to the channel and click the notification bell so you know when we come live. We come live Mondays, Wednesdays, Fridays, and we do a meditation on Saturdays. So please come and join us. And again, I want to thank my patron supporters. I also want to let everybody know live today that if you want to book a reading with me, you can go to my website, williammichaelforbes.com. I've got a Christmas holiday season special on that runs until December 24th, where you may purchase a reading with me at a discount. You just have to go to discount. You enter, when you book a reading with me, enter the coupon code 1959, and I look forward to having a reading with you. I want to wish you all much love. I look forward to seeing you on Wednesday with Archangel Michael. Much love, everybody. Bye for now. Have a great day.